So this week and next week, we're going to speak about a very interesting topic, in my opinion. A story with lots of action, lots of important lessons for life. And it's one of those stories in the Bible that's become, movies. There's lots of songs and art. You can see some examples of it here. If you see the pictures, you'll probably understand we're going to talk about Joseph and his brothers, his life. So Joseph's life is very relevant for us. I want to start with a quote from C.S. Lewis. Since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. I like this quote because it's real. As a parent, I know that the world that they're entering is not an ideal world. It's difficult. There's lots of sin and challenges. And there's something in the fact that we teach them stories. And, there's something added to this story that is interesting. When we teach them these real stories about people who lived here and who were faithful, and they dealt with grief or suffering. They knew what it was to deal with sexual temptation, and all these different things we see in Joseph's story. And why is it so relevant? Has a lot of topics. So here's a few. Talks about family life, successful family life, or less successful, lack of righteousness or justice, the meaning of sin and the repercussions of that. We'll see this in Joseph's story and in the book of Genesis in general, that there's meaning to sin. God remains faithful, but there is meaning to sin. We'll see also a very interesting passage that talks about why it's important for us to be a good testimony at our workplace, wherever God puts us. Why is it important for us to be faithful there? Now, the story of Joseph is not disconnected. It comes at the end of Genesis. And before we actually dig into the passage, which starts in chapter 37, we're going to do a very kind of a brief overview of the book of Genesis and see what the background is to the story of Joseph. And then after that, we're going to focus on Joseph's story this week and next week, maybe a week after that also. Before I begin, I want to say that I had the chance to read this book and I was really blessed by it. And a lot of things that I was thinking of as I was preparing this sermon came from this book by a man called John Lennox. He also had a series of lessons that are available on YouTube. It's in English. But if you're interested, then very recommended. And another source that I was really blessed by in the last few weeks is a website of maps. It's free. Very recommended. Has a really good quality. And it's, all these different maps that are related to, the Bible. And you'll see these different maps appearing. So a brief overview of the book of Genesis to kind of understand the background. It's quite a long book, first book in the Bible. And of course, it begins with the creating of the world. It talks about the world before sin, how God created it, Adam and Eve. And then it explains how it came to be that we live in a broken world, how the world we live in is full of sin. It explains the story of how sin entered. But then, in chapter 3, we have a turning point. Because what happened? God created Adam and Eve. He gave them the perfect place. And they decided that they're going against him. We decided that we're going against God. And in Genesis 3, verse 15, there's a promise for the future about something that's going to happen. And it says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." He's speaking about something futuristic that will happen, where the snake will hurt someone's heel, but that person will step on the snake's head. And this is about Satan, the enemy. The book of Genesis doesn't go straight to the person who's going to conquer and win. It talks about the repercussions of sin, the consequences. The fact that there will be victory one day doesn't mean that there's not situations. We see this in Cain and Abel's story. We see this in the flood. And from chapters 4 to 12, that's what happens in Genesis. And then there's another turning point. We see in these chapters that there's kind of, things become worse until the flood comes, and it's like a reset. But then we get to chapter 12, which tells us the story of Abraham. And from here until the end, including Joseph's story, we see how this story of this promised person who will come and squash that snake, how it develops. First of all, God chooses Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob. And through these chapters, again and again, we have promises. Promises that they will inherit the land. They will have inhabitants as much as the stars. And that through these generations, everyone will be blessed. The whole world will be blessed. I'll show a few examples, but first, when we think about God's promise, we think it's like kind of straight. That's how I imagine it. At least it's like a direct line. Like, this is what will happen. It's a straight line. But what happens in between in reality? Sin. Us. And this line becomes like this, a mess. Something unclear. And we hear a lot of stories that aren't simple. We see lives that are kind of messy in Genesis. There's mistakes, there's lies, there's trickery, anger, famines. All these different things happen. But what do we see? That despite all these things, God remains faithful. He will remain faithful to his promises. Despite the messy lives, sins, all the external factors, God remains faithful. Now, we know this, but when we think about it, when we think about Joseph, Abraham was his great-grandfather. And, we have these generations. This is all part of the identity. And we don't read it disconnected. When we read Joseph's story, it's not disconnected from the history that came before. So just to summarize kind of shortly, the promises that God had for Abraham, probably know this from Genesis 12, 1-3. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." Here's the first promise. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you." We see here already these promises, and here's the first map. Abraham is far away, and God calls him. There are some arguments regarding the locations of some places. So Abraham gets to Haran, and then God calls him. In the end, Abraham gets to Shechem, and with these promises that we mentioned before. In the continuation, we see that after the story with Isaac, we see this in Genesis 22:16, and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." So we see this promise, and we can see it reoccurring. Abraham and Sarah have Isaac, and these promises return in Genesis 26, verses 2-6. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land By the way, Egypt is repeated here a few times. Sometimes people go down there, sometimes they don't go down there. That's an interesting point. Stay in the land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands and will confirm the earth I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. We see again the promise. It's promised not just to Abraham, not just to Isaac, that he'll receive the land and he'll have descendants, but the whole world is included here. And the continuation of this promise is also to Jacob. When he sees the ladder going up and down, we see in Genesis 28, verse 13, there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. So we see these promises that repeat themselves through the generations. But we said that life is also messy. And these are long chapters. From 12 to 37, there's a lot of stuff that happens. We won't go through all of it, but just a few interesting points here. We see that Abraham lies that Sarah is his wife. I don't know if you remember the story. She says, don't tell him that I'm your wife, say that you're my brother. Then we have the story of Hagar and Ishmael. There's one whole mess that happens from that story. And then we have Isaac, who lies that Rebecca is his wife. Another similar story, that she is his sister, not his wife. And there's a story where they find out that it's a lie. And what does it mean? I mean, what kind of testimony is that when you find that out? We know the story that Esau sells his birthright to Jacob for the stew. We know that Jacob tricks his father into giving a blessing. We know that he is old and he can't see very well, and he manages to trick him. And Rebecca, who loved Jacob more than Esau, tells him how to dress, how to behave as if he's his brother, and to trick the father into giving the birthright blessing to him. And there's many other stories, but I want us to focus on one specific thing that happens with Jacob, because what will happen now will lead to Joseph's story and his brothers. So after Rebecca and Jacob trick Isaac, Esau wants to kill Jacob. They're two brothers, brother who wants to kill brother. And we'll see this again in Joseph's story, brothers who want to kill one another. And Isaac and Rebecca send him back to Haran, the place where Abraham came from. There he meets Laban, and he tells Laban, I'll wait 7 years for Rachel. So Jacob, who just tricked his father, now Laban will trick him. And Laban tricks him. He works 7 years not to get Rachel, who he fell in love with, but he gets Leah. And Laban says, I have to give you the oldest daughter first. This is tradition. So he promises to work another 7 years, and he gets Rachel. And then we have a long passage that describes the boys that are born, Rachel and Leah. But not just Rachel and Leah, but Bilhah and Zilpah were concubines. Bilhah was Rachel's woman servant, and Zilpah was Leah's. So Jacob has these 4 women, and he has from Leah, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and Judah. Reuben is the oldest. Then Rachel says, okay, take Bilhah, her woman servant, and he has Dan and Naphtali from her. So Leah sees this and says, okay, take Zilpah. And to have two more kids, God in a shell from her. Then Leah has more children, Issachar and Zvulun. And then Rachel has Joseph and Benjamin. So Joseph is number 11 out of all the brothers. Then we have Benjamin. Complicated family here. Not an ideal family structure, let's say. 12 boys, and Leah also has Dinah. With this kind of complicated family, Jacob decides it's time to go back to Canaan. There's a whole story about Lavan who wants to, run away. We'll skip that whole story. But Jacob understands that he needs to go back to his brother, the one who he stole the birthright from and the blessing. And it's written that Jacob was very afraid. He sends members before to, bow down. And there's a story where he wrestles with God. And all this happens. Why do I want to mention this specifically? Because there's two brothers, Jacob and Esau, that had a very bitter fight. So bitter, so much anger and jealousy, that Esau wanted to kill Jacob. And what does Joseph see at the end? Specifically, it says about Joseph, which is interesting, that he bows down to Esau, him and his brothers. What does this teach him as a little boy, where he sees two brothers coming to terms? They had this giant fight, and they find a way to reconcile. They find a way to live again. I don't know how old exactly he was, how much he exactly understood, but of course I'm sure he understood more about this later on. The idea of forgiveness is a very central idea, very important theme, a very monumental moment when there's this forgiveness. And we'll talk about that in a future sermon. But with all this complicated family situation, we see also all the promises of God, and we come to the story of Joseph. So we're going to focus on Genesis 37. We're not going to read everything, but some specific parts. And we're going to see the beginning of this hate developing between the brothers. And the next sermon, we're going to see how God prepares Joseph for his life mission, and how this preparation will be with a lot of suffering. And in the third sermon, then we will see the reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers, and how they go back to maintaining that relationship of brothers. So when we spoke about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we didn't really see a lot of suffering. We see that they make mistakes, that they sin, and because they're sins, then there are repercussions. We didn't see that they had to endure suffering in order to get something. So we even see how God will use Joseph's suffering and will even try him in order to fulfill his purposes. So how will Joseph suffer? We know that Joseph is very known as someone who reflects the Messiah, because what's going to happen? His brothers are going to reject him. His brothers are going to betray him. His own people of his flesh and blood are going to cast him away. And it comes to the point where his father thinks he's dead. And this is kind of like, the bottom, the worst part. He thinks that Joseph is dead and he'll never see him again. And Joseph was interesting. He's going to suffer a lot, even though he wasn't guilty. He wasn't to blame. And then we'll have the turning point where Joseph comes before the emperor king in Egypt, and he'll receive a new status with this honor and power. And then he'll become a blessing to the Gentiles, to the Egyptians, to the people around who come to take food, and to his own family. And we see that God's promises start to fulfill themselves in this way or another. And we read Joseph's story, there's a lot of points that are parallel to Christ's life. And we read the story, we can even pay attention to them and think about them more in depth. So with all this background, a lot of background here, but we'll start at Genesis 37, and we'll read from verses 1 to 11. So Genesis 37, 1 to 11. I recommend following along with your own Bible. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, in the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And then they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. And this time, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he had told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your brother, and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. In the first verse, we start with seeing Jacob, who is sitting in Canaan. After he'd gone to Haran, coming back, making up with Esau, he's in Canaan. How in such a small family, sitting in the promised land, how are they going to be a blessing to all the nations? How are God's promises going to be fulfilled? They're less than 100 people. How are they going to bless the whole world? And the story will develop, and we will see Joseph become someone who blesses. So first of all, we see a few points here about Joseph and his brothers. So Joseph, in verse 2, it says that he brought his father a bad report about them. So Joseph comes and tells his father about something his brothers did. A second point here is that Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his other sons, and he made him a special robe. He loves him more than the others. Now, he doesn't keep this as a secret. He gives it something very physical, something very like, look at this. He gives him something physical, the special robe, which is like a sign. And he's basically setting him apart from everyone else, saying, "You're different. I love you more than everyone else." Was this a smart move on Jacob's part? I don't really think so. But add on top of that, Joseph comes to his brothers and says, "Look, you're going to bow down to me. I'm going to be a king. You're all going to bow down to me." King in some shape or form. And basically these brothers are like, "We're going to bow down to you?" And he says, "Oh wait, I had another dream. And now the sun and moon and the stars are bowing down to me." And then he goes and tells his father and brothers as well. His father doesn't really understand, and he rebukes him in verse 10. It says, "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" It's kind of incomprehensible, especially in the culture back then. The father bowing down to the son didn't really function that way in culture. The son, honors the father. So the opposite is very strange. It's also interesting that his father kept this in mind. Jacob had enough experience in life with God, dreams, and things that happened in his life, that maybe he understood that there's something here. Maybe this is how this promise will be fulfilled. Maybe through Joseph. Maybe this is how a promise will continue and develop. But what happens? Here, Instead of seeing Joseph, take reign somehow in this family, we see quite the opposite. His brothers who hear Joseph's dreams, they're quite sick of it. They want to get rid of him. They're in Shechem, and Jacob sends Joseph to his brothers, Joseph and his brothers, to go take care of the sheep. And we won't read all of it, but it's from verses 12 to 26. Joseph arrives, and someone says, "Your brothers aren't here. They're in Dotan." You can see on the map, it's up there, Dotan. What's interesting is that this was a route where a lot of merchants took things to Egypt. And so his brothers see Joseph, and they want to kill him. And Reuben says, "No, we're not going to kill him, but we'll throw him in a well." And in his mind, he's like, "I'll come and save him afterwards." So they throw him into this well that didn't have water in it. And basically, these different merchants, I guess you'd call them, come by on their way to Egypt. And they decide, we're not going to kill our brother, but let's sell him. It's a more elegant way to get rid of him. We'll sell him, and we'll even get some money from it. Great deal. So they get 20 coins of silver. When you hear someone selling someone for getting some silver, it kind of reminds us of a different story on a much bigger measure, but the story continues. The brothers take Joseph's robe and they put blood on it. Jacob sees this robe and he thinks that he was killed by some kind of wild animal. Now, does this sound familiar? A son misleading his father? Jacob tricking his father? And see how this repeats itself here. Now, there's something a little bit cynical here. The sons try to comfort Jacob. Jacob doesn't want to be comforted. He's weeping. Verse 35. And they keep this lie in their hearts for many years. Many years. It's not like a few weeks later, they're like, "Oh, we regret it. Dad, we lied to you. This is actually what happened." This is going to be a lie that they keep as a secret for many years. And that's very destructive. When we read later on in Genesis, in 42, in Genesis 42, we see a little bit of Joseph's suffering. The brothers are speaking between them. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished," verse 21, "because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why the distress has come upon us." Joseph was begging them not to do that. "Don't sell me." He sees these people on the camels and they sell him as a slave. And his status as a brother, as a son, everything he had, whoever he was, his identity changed. He became a slave at that moment. He became someone else's property. That's how they treated him. And in the continuation, we see this. This is a spoiler for the next chapters. Joseph is sold to Potiphar. But this event kind of reminds us of Yeshua. It reminds us how they didn't, kill him himself. They just sold him. And those coins that they received reminds us kind of what happened with Judas Iscariot. If we look at Matthew 26:14, then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. One of the 12. 12 brothers, 12 disciples, and one of them betrayed Yeshua. Now, the promise to Jacob has to develop somehow, has to continue. And we see Jacob's family deteriorating. One of the brothers is taken. Jacob thinks he's dead. But we see the result of sin and action. There's anger, jealousy. We see that the family is a bit of a mess. We see the jealousy between the brothers. But Joseph received dreams that at some point he was going to have a role. His brothers were going to bow down to him. And see what the brothers do. Instead of trying to understand how this will happen, why this will happen, they just reject their brother. Now I want to kind of extract a few things from the passage to think about. Some practical things. First of all, Joseph went and told his father about what his brothers did. Was it gossiping? Was it reporting? Was it necessary? Was it correct? The second thing, the connection between brothers, the relationships, the jealousy, and the preference of the parents. We also see what happened to Joseph in this family dynamic. So Joseph comes to his father and says the brothers are doing something they shouldn't do, probably in the context of work, probably something they were doing while they were watching the sheep. So should Joseph have done this? Was Joseph gossiping, tattletaling? We don't have something specific in the passage, but when you look up topics on the internet, I looked up gossiping, and it says it's basically a conversation or passing on personal information that's not in front of him, whether it's correct or not correct, and it's not with good intentions. So is that what Joseph did? Now let's think about us for a second. When I see a colleague at work, someone who I work with, doing something that isn't really good, something that's a half-truth, let's say he gives a half-truth to the boss. If I see someone do something that's not what I would do, or not exactly straight, let's call it, what do we do? Now, the story doesn't give us a direct answer. I think maybe that's also something we're supposed to learn. Sometimes it's very confusing, very challenging. And maybe a good way to examine it in every situation, because we're in different situations, different families, different situations, different life. Each one of us will meet specific situations where we see something and we ask ourselves, what do I do with this right now? What do I do with this information that I have? Something I saw someone do. Do I need to tell someone or not tell someone? Maybe a good way to examine it when I talk about someone else, what is my goal? Is my goal to build them up or to destroy them? Is my heart in the right place? Is my heart in the right place? In Romans 8:33, it says what Yeshua decided to do. Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. Interceding for us. Yeshua had all power to stay in heaven and report everything bad he saw, and believe me, there's plenty, but he decided to do something else. He decided to be the interceder, the one who came here, died for our sins, and became the one who sat at the right hand of God and speaks well about us, our interceder, the one who protects us before our Father. And Yeshua loved us so much that he was willing to do that for us. That's the value that he sees in us, the value he sees in every single one here, this value that he was willing to die for us. And when Yeshua looks at us this way, brothers and sisters, how do we look at our brothers and sisters? And this brings us to our second point. We see the relations between the brothers, the jealousy. We know that Jacob loved Joseph more than the other children. Instead of keeping that just in his heart to himself, he had an external expression of it. It's created a lot of jealousy. As a parent, this is a question for me, how do I treat my children? Every child, very different. How do I treat them? Do I have a preference? What's happening in my heart when I'm looking at them? As a brother in a family. When we're inside of a family, how do I treat my brothers and sisters? And as a spiritual family, if we look at it from that point of view, Joseph's success caused jealousy and anger. Now, he's like a 17-year-old. He has a dream, and he shares this dream. What does this mean? What do you think? But this causes his brothers to be angry or jealous. When I see my brothers and sisters in Christ succeeding, am I happy for them? Do I want them to succeed? Another question, do I want to fulfill God's purpose in their life? When I see a brother or sister doing something, and I say, that's the correct move, am I saying to myself in my mind, oh, you're not going to, succeed, it won't work? Or am I thinking, that's interesting. How is God going to fulfill his promise in your life? Do we act together as a body that's pushing itself forward? Or are we busy thinking about how we're going to trip one another up? We see what Yeshua was willing to do. We also see what Yeshua told us to do. In John 13:34, Yeshua says, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Yeshua, who gave everything for us, tells us to love one another. We have to remember that the way that we act as sisters or brothers is a testimony to the world. Is it a good testimony? I hope so. I believe it is. But we have this responsibility. And the third thing that I'll finish with, what kind of stories did Joseph grow up with in his home? It's interesting because we have, the generations that we read about before in Genesis, and from these stories we can learn a lot. There are promises from God, a promise that there is a God and that he wants to be involved in their lives. God speaks to Abraham. He speaks to a person. God, who created the world, speaks to Abraham. What does that mean about the kind of God? Joseph is going to be sent now to Egypt, where there's a lot of idols. A lot of idols that people bow down to. What does he know about his God? It's a God who you can hear his voice, who you can speak with, a God that you can even wrestle with, like that story when Jacob wrestles with God, a God who fulfills promises, a God who is personal, alive, active, and close. So does Joseph think about these things when he was a slave and all he has are these stories? Was he meditating on them? At the end, Genesis 50, after Joseph confesses before his brothers, he's speaking to them, and in Genesis 50:24, it says, "Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land, to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." These stories were known to Joseph. He knew God made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He became a slave. He had nothing, but what held him together? What held him over this time? Not days or weeks, years of suffering. He had this faith in God that he's alive and can act. And inside of all of this mess in Joseph's life, was he focused on the thought that God is faithful? That everything that happened to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the good and the bad, and all of this mess, God was faithful. Maybe God will be faithful to me too. It doesn't mean that there's not consequences to sin. Joseph was experiencing in his life the consequences of sin, but he knew that despite that, God was faithful. Is that not an encouraging message for all of us? I haven't met anyone who's had a perfect life. I haven't met anyone who has the perfect, pure life that we all desire to live before God. And this meets reality again and again and again. our reality, our family's reality, our surroundings, but inside all of that, God is faithful. Inside all of that, God is faithful, forgiving, and fulfills his promises. And thank God that we have the privilege, and I hope we do this every day, not just on Saturdays, but to be filled with God's goodness and the reminder that he is faithful. So, in conclusion, we saw the promises that God gave Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We saw their messy lives. We saw the beginning of Joseph's story and what led to him being sold. And we have these 3 practical points to think about, which is gossiping and reporting, the connection between brothers, what kind of testimony is that, and the kind of stories he grew up with. And we'll see in the next sermon what happened with Joseph when he was in his workplace with Potiphar, the wife, etc. So we'll finish in prayer. Father, Lord, we thank you that you left these stories for us written so that we could learn from them, that we could see stories of real people who lived real lives, lives full of difficulties and challenges, stories that are sometimes hard to understand. But inside all of this, you remain faithful. Inside all of this, we see that Christ loves us. Yeshua, who was rejected by his people, even one of the disciples who was closest to him, he let it happen because he loved us so much. He was willing to go to the end because he was faithful to the promises that were given way back then to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're here because you promised promises and you fulfilled them. Thank you that we are here to worship your name, Lord. Thank you for your faithfulness. In Yeshua, our Lord's name.